In 2007, Ghana discovered oil and gas offshore. It was a turning point, providing the country with a whole range of new possibilities.
We estimate it at about 5 to 10 trillion cubic feet. Now, to put it in perspective, it's very modest compared to what Nigeria, for instance, has of about 200 TCF. But I will tell you that we've really made good of our reserves in terms of stopping things like Dumso, as you're aware. Whilst Nigeria still have some issues really of actually making use of their reserves to address issues of power.
Today, natural gas plays a key role in Ghana's energy sector, and the demand for it continues to grow rapidly. Thermal generation capacity is growing, and so is demand. The petrochemical industry is now within reach, and the possibilities are vast.
Now that we are having more people employed within the sector, you're seeing that it's providing income. The number of service companies in the oil industry has multiplied. Now we have a solely Ghanaian-owned exploration and production company, which we didn't have before. So we are seeing the growth manifesting in that arena. We're also seeing growth in terms of the revenues.
The main players, and we usually want to talk about the gas value chain from the upstream, where we have exploration and production. The players there are the international oil companies and GNPC, who actually holds custody or trusts of the commodities for the government. Then when you come to the midstream, which comprise gathering infrastructure, processing infrastructure, and transmission infrastructure, we have Ghana Gas. Then, of course, distribution and utilization by end users such as VRA and the power companies, the IPPs.
Gas from these fields can boost domestic energy supplies and add an additional generation capacity in excess of 1,000 megawatts. Ghana's existing installed electricity generation capacity is 3,795 megawatts, and there exists the natural gas to fuel the plants. With adequate supplies of gas, Ghana may be in a position to reduce its use of expensive crude oil. More importantly, it will lead to a major reduction in carbon emissions. But how quickly can these resources translate into production?
Energy demand growth in Ghana is just around 10%, year on year. That then means that at the end of every year or going into the new year, you have to build in the equivalent of one thermal power plant, in the country. That's roughly about 250 kind of megawatts. So if you do not add enough capacity to the system, then over time, what that means is that the demand is going to outstrip the supply, and then you end up having these recurrent issues of power cuts, or intermittent, power being made available for industry and then for domestic, consumption.
Given the need for adequate supplies of natural gas, the government has put in place plans to directly import liquefied natural gas. But how will this impact the development of the domestic and regional gas market?
The first starting point will be, what is your demand-supply balance? In other words, how much gas do you need for both power and non-power applications, and how much do you have?
We've seen through the figures from the companies like Gridco that demand for gas really isn't increasing as fast as we speculated it would increase in the recent past. And with gas coming on board from the Tano Basin in quantities that are expected to be sufficient, you realize that in the near future we are in a place where we don't need any more from anywhere else. What we have is very sufficient. But when you look into 2030 and beyond, the possibility that production may plateau or start to decline is there.
In order for the country to harness its natural gas resources in a positive way, it is critical that government puts in place the right policies and priorities for the next decade, with a focus on the upstream and power sectors. What exactly is the state of the country's institutional and regulatory framework? Several of the current challenges include the market structure and overlapping roles of agencies within the sector.
Energy policy planning in Ghana in general has often been a knee-jerk reaction to crisis after crisis rather than being a forward thought-out kind of like process. So we often see that the price at which we procure power, often in the situations where, because it's an emergency scenario, you have to go and get this power at sometimes very high prices than you would have gotten in normal circumstances, and that has an impact on industry.
We have to minimize the amount of regulatory agencies that we have. If you take the US, for instance, or even Canada, if you take the entire value chain that I've mentioned, you usually have one regulatory agency.
I think the key one is to make sure that the regulatory regime is right. The legislation to support the gas industry needs to be clear. I think there's a gas law that's under the works that would come out that needs to be completed quickly.
There's significant infrastructure deficit. Even though the resources are there, getting the resources to the market centers or the places or points of utilization, it's a problem because they are just absent, they are not there.
We have a lot of gas in the western part of the country. The main sources of generation are in the eastern part of the country. And today we cannot get the gas from the west to the east.
So why don't we have the infrastructure? I think what is really hampering infrastructure development as well is the fact that we don't have easy access to capital.
For me, the greatest challenge is financial, because once the gas is there, it must be used. But who's using the gas? VRA. Is VRA able to pay for the gas it's using? No.
The sector has financial challenges. So we have financial challenges as well. Most of it comes from the fact that we don't have sufficient liquidity in the sector. We generate electricity, there's collection that's done at one end, but the money doesn't flow up the chain back to us. And so there's a collection issue at the distribution sector, it doesn't come up to us. So all of us along the whole power supply chain suffer from this.
If that legacy debt issue in the energy sector is not resolved, we would feel the ripple effects on the development of the natural gas sector, because that revenue that is needed to be able to invest in infrastructure will just not be there.
One, we've got to make sure that our power supply industry itself is self-sustaining. The pricing issues with electricity, the revenue collection, and all that are addressed as a matter of course. And then we've got to make sure that as much of our electricity as can be used is used for industry. And we've got to make sure that we have the right type of industries that give us a comparative advantage with what we have in our economy. And then we must also focus on this petrochemical industry on the back of the natural gas we have and the gas opportunities in the sub-region to develop a petrochemical industry.
The first thing that we would like to do, and as most countries do, is to develop a master plan. A master plan, essentially a roadmap for the development efforts. Then you have to ensure that you have the appropriate institutional and regulatory frameworks in place for anyone who wishes to really invest in that industry. So you have the roadmap, and then you have the institutions in place. And the regulatory agencies particularly, you must have a technical one and also a financial one, because the pricing of these commodities will have to be regulated by these institutions. And then we have to build capacity. It is not helpful if for every development effort we have to import expertise. So we have to build local capacity to be able to address the shortcomings in the development of the industry.
Clearly, work needs to be done, because there are numerous examples of countries who mismanage their gas resources through lack of adequate structures, policies, and planning. If we are to avoid the same fate, then Ghana's oil and gas resources need to be managed efficiently and transparently so that the country as a whole can benefit. If there is to be economic growth, there will be the need for adequate energy supplies. China and India are today world economic superpowers not by accident.
They had sufficient energy to drive whatever economic strategies they had. China, when it started, and I think today it still is in the same mode of the strategy was to have an export-led economy. So they developed industries and did a lot of exports. India, the same way. India is also moving into ICT, etc. But as I said, the backbone for all this is energy. Once you are energy self-sufficient, you can build on the other things.
The models they used were essentially lowest cost power, lowest cost labor, and then lowest cost raw materials. If you have these three, you really are in for a good competitive regime.
Premiumbeat.com